About a year ago, I refreshed my knowledge on the Communist Red Army's famous Long March, on which I was supposed to be an expert by default since I grew up in China. I decided to read on it not because I want to be 11 again, but because while I was pondering on other key events in CCP history, they all point me to the direction of the Long March. Like, this is where it all began. It became obvious to me that the famous military act, whose literature and stories I learned so well in school, was just a fraction of the historical event. As my eyes jumped from one wiki page to another, the same questions crop up again and again. Who were these people? How did they manage to survive? And what about those battles I've been hearing about since I was a kid, like Jinshajiang, Daduhe, Liupanshan? Attempts to immortalize the Long March have largely been a success in China. So the purpose of my video is to look at the Long March in a more objective way and to put it into historical perspective. In my opinion, the emphasis on the military achievements of the Long March stole away the more important but often ignored implications of the event. However, this is not an academic video, so I have allowed myself to be subjective in my selection of topics and to give perhaps disproportionate space to those that are illustrative of the various moments. For example, the Zunyi Conference, the Battle of Chishui, and of course, Mao Zedong. By the way, Long March isn't what the CCP named the operation when they left their base in Jiangxi, but rather they call it a strategic retreat or relocation in order to escape from the Nationalist Army's barricade in southern China. Today, the Nationalist Party in Taiwan still use the name Xicuan for this year-long repivot of the Red Army. It literally means exile to the west. Before the Red Army decided on the retreat, they had no clue where they would end up and no idea how long it would take. They thought they would stop and settle down in Hunan, but in the end, they spent over a year on the road, crossing over 10 provinces, totaling to about 10,000 kilometers. It's about the distance if you drive from Lisbon to Karachi or from Moscow to Vladivostok, the easternmost city of Russia. I know it sounds a bit crazy. How is it even possible? Well, although Jiangxi, the starting point, it's only about 1,500 kilometers from Shanbei, the endpoint. But remember, the Red Army didn't go via a straight line. In order to minimize confrontation with the Nationalist Army, they took a huge detour to the southwest provinces like Guizhou and Sichuan, where it was more like mountaineering than marching. Sometimes they spent days going back and forth around the same spot to get rid of nationalist troops chasing behind. This is the most common description about the Long March, that somehow the Red Army outmaneuvered the Nationalist Army and established a new base to continue their revolution. Yet there's also a less exciting, less dramatic side of the story. You see, the Red Army was formed almost overnight after Jiang Jieshi decided to purge the communist members within the Nationalist Party. The Red Army is a collective name for all the revolutionist units and bands scattered across southern China, many of whom had just jumped ship from the nationalist side. For example, some of the most prestigious CCP leaders in later time, like Ye Jianying, He Long, and Peng Dehuai, all joined the Red Army in protest against Jiang Jieshi. Soon, the CCP became synonymous with riots and strikes, but those were quickly cracked down by the nationalist government. For years following its establishment, the Red Army suffered from failure after failure due to an overall inexperience in modern warfare and an almost non existent central command. defeats and fiascos were still common in the early days of the Long March. However, at some point, the Red Army transformed itself from a divided, demoralized armed group to a true force to be reckoned with, highly motivated and highly effective. So, what happened during the Long March? Before I dive into these questions, let me give you some background. In 1923, exactly 100 years ago, Sun Yat-sen, the chairman of the Nationalist Party, made a deal with the Soviet Union that in exchange for weapons and money, the Nationalist Party had to partner with the fledgling Chinese Communist Party. It was a pragmatic but strange partnership because at the time, the Chinese Communist Party was basically a small branch office established under the wing of the Soviet Union. Naturally, the Nationalist Party didn't see its junior partner as a threat. Communist Party members continued their operation and were even allowed to join the Nationalist Party with dual membership. CCP leaders like Zhou Enlai and Chen Yi were at the time high-ranking officers in the Nationalist Party. The honeymoon didn't last very long. Cracks started to show after the death of Sun Yat-sen, when Jiang Jieshi took power. On April 13, 1927, he gave orders to hunt down and eliminate Communist Party members by all means. In Shanghai alone, hundreds were killed and thousands were arrested. In retrospect, I think Jiang Jieshi's worry about the Communist Party being the Soviet Trojan horse is legit. As a matter of fact, the Communist Party was well on its way to turn around and become the senior partner of the Nationalist Party, a reversal of their initial relationship. However, Jiang Jieshi, being a military strongman, was too impetuous in his decision to use violence, which is usually reserved as the last resort. The purging of communist members had the opposite effect. Jiang Jieshi's reputation within the Nationalist Party was damaged, and people started to question his leadership. On the Communist Party side, the victims were martyred and thus justified any kind of revenge on Jiang Jieshi, the one who first pulled the trigger. Communist leaders around the country started to rise against the nationalist government. But like I mentioned, all of these riots ended up failing. Nevertheless, they gave rise to a bunch of people who organized these riots, and one of them was Mao Zedong. Let's talk about Mao Zedong for a bit. Despite being in charge of several high-profile uprisings, Mao had been relatively marginal within the Communist Party. We need to remember that the early CCP was a totally different species from the Chinese Communist Party we see today. Back then, the Communist Party was filled with people well versed in Marxist and Leninist theory and were trusted by Moscow. Despite having studied Marxism and written a few philosophical articles, Mao never felt entirely comfortable sitting with the Soviet educated bourgeoisie party leaders. A young man from a humble family in Hunan, he didn't speak their language, nor did he find them ready to wage a war against Jiang Jieshi. In fact, after waves of attack by the nationalist troops, the Red Army troops were cornered into several rural garrisons in the south and desperately needed to escape. It wasn't an easy task because the Nationalist Army and its allies controlled almost half of the country. To pull it off, pockets of Red Army merged into three divisions, and each had to find their own escape route. So, fairly speaking, there were not just one long march, but three that took place at around the same time. In this video, I'm only going to focus on the first division, not only because Mao Zedong was part of it, but also because future narratives about the Long March are mostly based on the journey of the first division. The famous battles were also narrated from the point of view of the 1st Division. One example is the Battle of Chushui River. Near the provincial border of Guizhou and Sichuan, Jiang Jieshi assembled more than 400,000 men to encircle the Red Army near Chushui River. Even today, as we see in the Russia-Ukraine war, armies on either side try to avoid combat that involves crossing a river. Troops can easily be cut in halves if the enemy destroys the bridge. The frontal force also risks being encircled once they cross the river. With all that in mind, the Red Army made 4 successful crossings of the river under the eyes of the nationalist troops. It wasn't that the nationalist government didn't send their best. In fact, Jiang Jieshi was so determined to give the Red Army a fatal blow that he flew to Guiyang and directed the battle himself. Micromanaging turned out to be a bad idea, because the Nationalist Army wasn't trained for guerrilla warfare, which the Red Army was used to since the very beginning. Nationalist firepower and warplanes were basically useless against communist ambushes and hit and runs. In the end, the Nationalist Army suffered heavy losses, while the Red Army had just crossed its own Rubicon River. It wasn't just a win for the Red Army, but more importantly, it was the first victory under the command of Mao Zedong. He did command another battle in Tucheng earlier, but it didn't go well. You may ask, hadn't Mao always been the leader of the Red Army? After all, this cult-like following around Mao is known through numerous Chinese propaganda posters. It's almost like there's no equal of him, before and after. But the truth is, Mao Zedong emerged as the leader much later than people might think. Not until January 1935, or 3 months into the Long March. Right before the Battle of Chushui, the Communist Party leaders had a 3-day-long conference in Zunyi to discuss what's next. You probably have never heard of Zunyi. Today, it's a bustling city in Guizhou with spicy food and mild weather, surrounded by mountains and forests. The communist leaders couldn't care less about these things when they arrived in Zunyi, because they had something urgent to discuss. Yes, they did break through the nationalist line of defense, but at a huge cost. Just 2 months ago, the Red Army lost almost half of its men when crossing the Xiang River in Hunan. Even before the Long March, in 1932, the Red Army's naive attempt to take over the city of Ganzhou from the nationalist government ended up a total failure, losing a lot of soldiers and a bunch of senior commanders. It was also a PR disaster, since it took place around the same time when the Nationalist Army was busy fighting against the Japanese. Just imagine how bad it looked on the CCP. Therefore, for years, Mao Zedong had held a grudge against the senior CCP leaders, who wanted to conquer big cities at whatever cost and were suspiciously close to the Soviet Union. In contrast, Mao Zedong believed that revolution in China has to be set off from the vast rural areas, kind of like how Trump won the 2016 election. And the Red Army should conserve manpower and ammunition by avoiding direct combat with the Nationalist Army. The discontent reached a breaking point in Zunyi, where the Mao faction, only a few people at the time, openly criticized Bogu and Li De, the party leaders. You probably never heard of Bogu and Li De. They were both key figures in early Chinese Communist movement. Idealistic and well-educated as they were, they just didn't know how to fight a war. Today in China, textbooks and CCP literature still associate the names of Bogu and Li De with opportunism and arbitrary decision-making. But I think they deserve better than this. Even after they got demoted from top leadership, they continued a lot of secretary work for the CCP. Bogu was key in the negotiation with the Nationalist Party on unifying against the Japanese. Li De, who is actually German with the real name of Otto Braun, stayed with the Red Army throughout the Long March and left for Soviet Union only after 1939. Like I said, the narratives about the Long March only revolves around the people who later led the party. I don't think Hao Bogu and Li De's contribution is less significant than the others. But as Churchill said, history is written by the victors. By the time they left Sichuan, the Red Army had fought a series of well-coordinated battles in Jinshajiang, Daduhe, and Liupanshan. These victories further strengthened Mao's status within the CCP. And the CCP that we're now familiar with started to take shape. For example, Mao understood very well the importance of propaganda. Whenever the Red Army passed by a town or a village, the so-called work group would knock on people's door, talk to them, and explain what the Red Army is doing, and why are they coming all this way to here. Back then, it was well known that the Red Army is not an army of looters. They always make purchases from local farmers and shops at a fair price. That being said, they would confiscate the land and assets of big landowners and distribute it among the villagers. The local people were quickly won over by measures like these. We now see abundant accounts of local villagers eagerly joining the Red Army or volunteered to take care of injured soldiers in their homes. Some of these accounts were written by nationalist personnel who previously surrendered and were held captive by the communists. They tried to stay chill about the apparent kindness and optimism the Red Army soldiers have in comparison with their nationalist comrades. It's interesting to read how they praise the Red Army for treating the local people well while still referring to them as bandits or commie. As Mao Zedong later said in a speech, the Long March itself is a manifesto, a propaganda force, and a seeding machine for the revolution. After Sichuan, the Red Army no longer had the threat of being annihilated by the nationalist troops. But now they had entered the Tibetan land, which is extremely barren and still known today as a no-go area. For about 6 days, the Red Army had to march across a vast wetland full of dangerous swamps without any food and water supply. Every morning, there were casualties due to freezing during sleep. Many saw their comrades fell, drowned to death in front of their eyes. Like the Col de la Loze of the Tour de France and the Swiss wall for skiers, the few hundred kilometers between Songpan and Banyou was the hardest stretch of the Long March. After Banyou, they marched further north and once again defeated the Nationalist Army at Lazikal. Now finally, they could almost see the finish line. On October 19, 1935, the Red Army 1st Division reached Wuqizhen in Shanxi, marking the end of the Long March. Works on spreading the stories of the Long March began soon after the Red Army reached Yan'an, the CCP's Canaan. Mao Zedong encouraged participants of all ranks to write down what they saw and encountered during the year-long journey, which became the basis for the epic track portrayed in books and plays we see today. Apart from their political value, these accounts are of high ethnological value as well. For example, when the Red Army was marching through the southwest provinces, they made several encounters with ethnic minority locals like the Miao people and the Yi people. The majority Han people living outside were so scared of these villager warriors that for centuries there had only been minimal contact between them. No outsider had ever set foot on these villages or know how the people lived. In Mianning, which is still a very poor county in Sichuan, the Red Army mingled with the local Yi people. They learned their traditions and, of course, explained and translated how the Red Army is helping to protect the people, not exploiting them. In my opinion, the experience of witnessing such a dire human condition, in which many villagers were still hunter gatherers with no shoe or clothes, had a lasting impact on the CCP when it comes to selecting its leaders. Without an exception, the leader of the party has to have worked in a poor province in a prior position. But let's don't distract ourselves. The publishing and spreading of the Long March stories by the CCP was primarily to draw empathy and support from the general public. The stories about the plight of the Red Army proved more effective as a propaganda tool than any communist grand theory, drawing sympathy and stimulating a sense of patriotism among citizens. Citizens in big cities like Shanghai and Wuhan soon began to read about these stories in newspaper and pamphlets. This also helped pave the way for the Communist Army's later takeover of these cities. Edgar Snow's book, Red Star over China, written soon after the Long March, became a sensation among the left in the West. By 1937, the CCP not only secured a foothold in northwest China, but also gained tremendous moral appeal among Chinese of all classes. Today, the language of observers is less romantic, but the sentiments that mythologize the Long March persist. We now know that the Red Army wasn't spotless in their actions. In fact, they were ready to use violence on the landlords who wouldn't give away their land and money. And for a long time, the CCP tried to hide the fact that the Long March was carried out as an escape plan from the Nationalist Army, and claimed instead that they wanted to set up a military base to fight the Japanese in the north. I began my own study on the Long March equipped with much of the preoccupations that other Chinese people carry, and I would not pretend to have discarded them all. However, it has been my intention not to refract the Long March through the prism of winner or loser. After all, we're talking about a civil war where a group of Chinese people were trying to kill another group of Chinese people. So I prefer seeing the participants of the Long March not as single minded communist fighters, but rather just human beings like all of us. In fact, most people joined the Red Army not because they wanted to fight for a greater cause, but mainly because of severe food shortages at home. Keep in mind that the Red Army consists mostly of teenagers from rural areas who had never been to anywhere outside their villages. They had no idea what life is like in big cities. On one occasion, a young soldier wanted to buy some milk from a local shop in Wujing, Guangdong, and insisted that the shopkeeper was lying to him. The shopkeeper tried to explain that it's not milk, but black ink inside the bottle. Obviously, in the soldier's hometown, he had never seen a dark glass bottle carrying anything other than milk. Dialect is another issue. The soldier from Jiangxi couldn't understand a word spoken in Cantonese by the poor shopkeeper. To prove it, the soldier grabbed the bottle and started guzzling. All of a sudden, his mouth and tongue turned black, and he became an object of ridicule for a long time. On the other hand, many Red Army soldiers didn't find it difficult to adjust. While the soldiers were getting some rest in Zunyi, You can say that they were living kind of a bourgeoisie lifestyle. They were warmly welcomed by the locals, they shopped for new clothes, and spent generously at restaurants. One even filed a complaint against a tailor whom the soldier said was cutting corner. Life in Zunyi wasn't boring at all. The soldiers played basketball with local students and even had a dance party with the female students. Of course, none of them know what's going on among the top leadership. Unfortunately, most of these human side of the Long March was kept out of textbooks and studies. It's not difficult to see why the disclosure of leisure and unwinding would make contemporary Chinese people skeptical of the communist propaganda. If the Red Army soldiers could complain about long hours of walking and shortage of food, why can't we ask for better condition in our workplace? Today, if you walk into a random cinema in China, chances are that you will see 2 or 3 seriously made films about the Korean War or the anti Japanese War at the same time. What you probably won't see is any film about the Long March. One reason is that any film about the famous Odyssey would almost certainly cast the Communist Party in a positive light and the Nationalist Party in a negative one. But even with a certain level of detachment, a good film about the Long March will definitely trigger a wave of interest and discussions about the event. This, in my opinion, is not what the CCP want to see. CCP leaders realized early on that its highly centralized power structure is also very vulnerable. Any internal dispute or power struggle risks dragging down the party as a whole, like the split between Mao Zedong and Zhang Guotao during the Long March, the arrest of the Gang of Four, as well as the ongoing war against corruption. Therefore, what the CCP needs is a narrative that harkens back to its early struggles, a symbol that can inspire solidarity among everyone in the room. It basically sets up a common ground upon which party leaders are willing to settle disputes and make peace with each other. Without a doubt, the Long March is at the very center of that narrative. Personally, I see the frequency of state media bringing up early struggles like the Long March as a thermostat of the political temperature inside the CCP. Whenever something controversial comes down the pipeline, the official media would go on a propaganda rampage to remind people how the Communist Party has always had its challenges, but managed to steer through those difficult waters. Mao Zedong made a promise to his people that he would lead them out of encirclement and find the land to continue their revolution. He kept his promise. Similarly, the Chinese Communist Party today steeps its legitimacy in the promises it has fulfilled, like reducing poverty and catching up with the developed countries in terms of standards of living. I know what you're thinking. The grand promises made by Xi Jinping now sound more empty than ever. And yes, I think it's a problem that keeps them awake at night. For a long time, outrageous corruptions, bollocksing bureaucracy, skyrocketing home price have all hurt people's faith in the communist mandate. If working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, can barely cover the living expense, how would the younger generation have any hope for the future? Social mobility is another issue. By putting party members in charge of everything from the state company to the smallest city museums, the CCP has diminished its claim to be the party of change. In the end, I find the Long March to be a double edged sword. It saved the CCP from the brink of collapse, helping it gain confidence and popularity in times of uncertainty. But it also tempted the party into the trap of overpromising. Promises like these help them to get away with much needed reforms. And in practice, if the reform goal cannot be achieved in a reasonable amount of time, the party would substitute it with short term, quick profit. For example, the government was willing to hand out large amount of cash to relocate people from old neighborhoods in a city and build new skyscrapers. But without investments in science and research, those skyscrapers would only be left empty, creating the so called ghost towns. The native residents and the construction company do get a generous compensation like they were promised, but at the cost of China's long term growth. The recent bankruptcy cases in Chinese real estate and banking sectors signal a shift in government's tone. The people at the top are more and more concerned about this opaque idea that no matter how big the problem is, the central government will always come to its rescue, like a spoiled child. The Minister of Finance made it clear that the central government has never promised to cover the losses resulted from speculation and overborrowing. In other words, the free drinks are over. From now on, everyone needs to pay on their own. A modern government should not act as if it knows what the people want. The success of a country doesn't lie in how capable the government is in fulfilling its promises, but in the enterprises of individual citizens. It doesn't matter if a person's enterprise succeeds or not, as long as it's in his or her own hands. But to facilitate such a role change of the party and the government, Xi Jinping has a lot of tough battles to fight, like rebalancing the economy and removing or appeasing some entrenched interest groups. In my opinion, these seismic changes have already been ongoing for quite some time. They're just hard for people to notice. But something will not likely to change. The CCP will keep the wheels turning by promoting its past glories like the Long March. And the goal is to hold the country together in times of severe turbulences. So grab your seat. Let's see how the Long March of the 21st century will unfold.